Hello everyone, and welcome to the second part of my tier list series, the tier list for breakers. My last video was about attackers, so if you haven't seen that, go check that out. And this time we will be covering breakers. Now, this tier list is based on what I feel is the state of the current meta on the Japanese server. So for those of you who want info to plan out your polls and look ahead, this video is for you. It is not representative of the current state of things on the global server, but the info will more or less be accurate. And global will get up to this point anyways, and it'll be accurate then. So it's like there's little caveats. Basically, breakers are in a really weird spot right now. As far as the game goes, it's really weird. It's hard to explain because you haven't experienced it yet, but I'll just go through and sort of illustrate what I mean. Basically, enemy stun HP has been inflating significantly recently. So a lot of times I don't even use breakers nowadays for content, but I'll just show you what I mean. So let's go into the most recent score battle. And I'm going to be using Logy and Master Ryza. They are both strong against the score battle, so the enemies are weak to them. I'm not trying to show breakers in a bad situation for them. This is kind of like an optimal situation, right? They're both strong against the content. The enemies are weak to them. And what you're going to see is that in this latest content, this latest hard content on JP, they're not going to be breaking very well. They're not going to be stunning easily. So right off the bat, we can see that Ryza, with her skill 2, everything's weak. She's not even stunning the small enemies here. And you can see that Lara has 1300 stun HP. And he also has 1300, so yeah, not only is she not stunning the large enemies, she's not stunning anything. And Logy as well is only doing about a third of their stun gauges-ish, maybe 40%, not quite half. So he could stun a small enemy if he wanted to, but he can't stun the bosses. And this is sort of what I mean by breakers not being as useful recently. And we have so much damage that a lot of times, if you can't stun the enemy anyways, you may as well just go more damage and one-shot them instead. You do still get, of course, debuffs from Ryza. The debuffs are still very good. Or the buffs from Logy and other things like that. That's one thing that's going to be very pronounced in the tier list, is that breakers that do more than just stun are going to be much higher up. And it's not to say that breakers are completely useless for stunning. Obviously there is content where breakers still are used for stunning enemies or even required. It's just kind of off and on, and it's like a lot of content they really feel kind of useless, and then some content they feel really necessary. Breakers are kind of necessary in the most recent dungeon, but for the score battle, I might not even use them, right? So it just kind of depends. But basically, they're in a really weird spot in the meta right now, and it really depends on what the devs go forward with doing, how they want to balance breakers, because right now they're inflating enemy stun HP and making breakers worse that way, but I don't know if that's necessarily the correct answer to breakers. I mean, I was kind of fine with how they treated it before, where if they didn't want enemies to be trivialized through stuns, they just make them have really low stun wait time, and I thought that was fine. Now it's kind of weird. Also, my Ryza gear isn't bad either by any means. It's nearly perfect. It's not quite there, but it's pretty close. Same with Logy's gear, and they're still not stunning, right? So even if you have absolutely perfect gear, you might be able to barely make it. It's really awkward. But yeah, that's kind of the state of breakers right now on JP, and that will very much be reflected in the rankings. So they might look quite a bit different than what you're used to from global. Anyways, let us just, go off to the tiering. First and foremost, what you're going to see is that single target breakers with no other effects are going to actually be a bit higher up than area breakers. So Marion's going to go in B tier. She is just always solid as a single target breaker. I think everyone who's used her knows this. She has high speed, high stun values. She is kind of like the... Sorry, Lanza's speaking there, my bad. I wanted some different music. I forgot there were voice lines. So yeah, Marion's kind of like the gold standard for a single target breaker, for like a vanilla single target breaker, right? So she is going to go right there in the B tier. And then next we have Escha. And Escha's kind of interesting. I'm actually going to go ahead and put her into A. I think Escha's very powerful right now on JP, especially for her rarity and being a release unit. And one of the main reasons she is so strong is because she gives debuffs to two of the meta, debuffs and buffs to two of the meta elements, right? She lowers slash and air resistance and also gives a slash and air stun damage bonus to your other breakers. And two of the strongest breakers right now are Master Ryza, who is slash, and Gyaro Ryza, Academy Ryza, who is air. And as a single target breaker, Escha actually synergizes very well with them, and also a lot of teams that might use them. So she's actually very, very strong right now, in my opinion, on JP. I used her quite recently to clear the most recent dungeon, which was quite difficult, and she did wonderfully there. So I think Escha actually deserves a very high spot. Meanwhile, Sarah's going to go down into the C tier, and maybe even like C-, not quite D. She's not quite that bad, but this goes back to what I was saying before, where enemy stun gauges are so high now that vanilla area breakers can't really keep up. So not only is she slow, and her stun damage values just aren't high enough, and she doesn't supply anything else to your team. So whereas she used to be very, very strong near the start of the game, she has fallen off quite heavily, and she kind of belongs down in the C tier now. Next we have Mari. I don't know whether to put Mari in C tier or B tier. I think I kind of just want to put all of the more vanilla area breakers in C tier, because they really just are like kind of weak nowadays. They'll still be decent in certain content, but in a lot of the most recent content, they have fallen off quite heavily. Keith, of course, too slow to be useful. His multi-element gimmick is also quite bad. He's always been at the bottom of the breaker tier list, and he will continue to be at the bottom of the breaker tier list. Same deal with Raze. Even though he synergizes with Slash, he is just too slow to be useful, especially nowadays. Speed is creeping higher and higher than ever for breakers, and you really want your breakers to be at least like around 250 speed baseline, if not higher. Raze at 220, it's just really difficult to make him fast enough to really be particularly good. And then next we have Corneria, and Corneria is going to go in B tier. She's very similar to Marion in terms of speed and break potency, and she does synergize with strike resistances, which I do think makes her a bit worse than Escha in general as far as the meta goes. However, she can be decent with Rose Valeria, but there are better breakers than her for that specific niche. So yeah, it's just how it is, but she's still very solid. Next we have Pravda and Lili. They're just more kind of generic area breakers. They're just not really that great. Don't really like using them, so, you know. Yeah, just area breakers that don't really give any extra value to your team just aren't very good on JP nowadays. And then next we have Master Ryza, and she is of course still S tier. You know, her stun utility is falling off a little bit on her skill 2, but as enemy stun gauges continue inflating, her auto break on the burst is really, really impactful, right? If you create a burst with her, and a lot of attackers don't need bursts anymore to do damage, she can just stun anything, even if their stun gauge is like 3000, right? So not only is the auto break really strong, the debuffs from her skill 2 are really strong, and she does do the most area break of, she has way more stun damage than these area breakers, right? So she brings so many different things to the party that really, 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 really make her shine, and she is still just a top tier pick for JP. Next we have Lila. Lila is also going to get A tier as a very strong single target breaker. She's a bit stronger than Marion with her extra stun damage from her passives and her skill 2, and also the ice resistance, as well as fitting very neatly into one of the meta parties, being Ice Mari or Christmas Resna, right? New Year's Mari or Christmas Resna. She's very good with them. There are good ice attackers in the game, so good ice synergy does make her quite good as well. But even outside of those teams, she is the strongest single target breaker in the game when it comes to pure stun damage, which is very, very, very useful, right? So outside of course, Ryza's burst. So yeah, Lila's going to be quite good. Next we have Lot. It's always been really hard for me to place Lot personally. Her burst is of course very decent in giving damage to your party, and for that reason I think I can place her in B tier, but maybe like a low B. She is still not that great because area breakers just don't do quite enough in the current meta if they don't supply something to your team with their skill 2 other than just stun damage, right? So she's kind of awkward, but that's just, yeah. Anyways, next we have Logy. Logy is going to be A tier. He's just really solid. He is a single target breaker with an area burst, which in some ways is kind of better in a lot of cases than the opposite, an area skill 2 with a single target burst, but also he synergizes very, very, very well with one of the strongest attackers in the game, and that is Izana. So yeah, just his ability to give crits, guaranteed crits to Izana feels really nice, and usually if you combine him with another area breaker or another single target breaker, such as, you know, either of the Ryzas, usually he can break something and give that crit boost to Izana, and it'll be like slightly more useful than a supporter that just gives crit, right? Sometimes he can be awkward to use because of that. If you can't stun something with him, then you're not going to get the crit chance for Izana or any other attacker you might have that you want to give it to. Izana's the main one. But it's still quite useful. And crits are much higher value now on JP than they used to be. When Logy came out, I didn't think he was very good because crits were, like, the value of crits wasn't like super high. But now that we have the critical damage trait and a lot more critical damage scaling, the value of crits is higher than ever, and some sort of crit rate generation, crit rate buffing something on your team is invaluable. So Logy, if you can make Logy fit for that, he's quite solid, so he gets A tier. Then we have Valentine's Escha. Valentine's Escha is also going to be A tier. She is kind of awkward to use a lot of the time, but as far as giving your team damage, she is one of the best. If you have her fully kitted out with the physical resistance down traits, her skill 2 when stunning something can make the target take like 110% extra physical damage the next time for the next 2 attacks. Like, Escha's really, really, really good for physical based teams. And then her burst as well has a huge physical attack buff to your strongest physical attacker, and also a ton of increased physical damage taken on the enemy. And she has a single target breaker, so she is just really solid if you can get her debuffs on the enemy. Very, very good breaker, but not quite strong enough to get the S tier. She's not quite as all-purpose or meta-defining. She's just quite good. Next we have Stirk. Stirk is a free unit, so he is a base 1-star, and he's some weird like hybrid attacker breaker mix that doesn't really do either of them well, so he will also be taking the D tier. And finally we have Heidi. Heidi is an S tier breaker, believe it or not. She's kind of crazy. She is another strike, like single target breaker. So kind of in the same vein as Corneria, but much, much better. She reduces strike resistance before attacking with her skill 2, which obviously increases her stun damage, and it also fits in with meta attackers such as Rose Valeria. Also, when she stuns something, she instantly charges 30% of your item gauge, which is really, really good for doing things like double stacking items. Very, very strong in that regard. Double stacking items is very powerful if you can do it, and Yaidi makes it super easy with all of that, you know, item charge from stunning things with her skill, from stunning things as well. Her burst is one of the strongest bursts in the game. It is an area stun burst, and it has auto break on it. It only auto breaks targets that are weak to her, so they have to have minus 25% strike resist or lower. But this is very achievable with items or other things and in general, and it's a pretty easy condition to meet overall. And auto breaking the entire field is like crazy good, right? So just because of that, like even if her kit had nothing else, she's going to get S tier for the AoE auto break. However, also charging your item gauge and just being a really, really solid single target breaker on top of that, like Yaidi's crazy. She's so good. Next we have Academy Ryza, and to no one's surprise, she is also going to drop straight into S tier. She is very similar to Master Ryza. In fact, their kits are very, very close to each other. However, Academy Ryza only increases magic damage taken for the enemies. However, this is more of an upside than a downside in general because it can be scaled by traits now. So, you know, with Master Ryza, her debuff can't be scaled by any traits, but Academy Ryza's can, and most of the meta attackers are magic anyways, so like Academy Resna, Izana, they will all be very, very happy to have her on your team supplying debuffs. Now, the main downside to Academy Ryza as opposed to Master Ryza is that her burst is not auto-stun. It does not auto-break targets, so it is a bit weaker in that regard, but she is still a very, very strong character overall. Very, very, very good debuffer and good stun damage to boot. So that's one of the things you're going to notice about a lot of these high tier breakers nowadays is they are good debuffers, right? So Yaidi, or they like supply some other utility than just stunning enemies. So yeah, all these three characters very, very, very good. And last, we are going to have Pirate Totori, the newest addition to the Breaker roster. She is a slash single target breaker with a gimmick that creates red panels on enemies and also increases enemy physical damage taken. And she's gonna go into B tier. She seems kind of underwhelming to me. If you want a single target debuff supporter for physical attacks, like you're much better going with Valentine's Escha. And if you do need that panel gimmick, you might find a better way around that. Like she creates a red panel on the enemy she targets, but it's really awkward in practice. And if you use items, that red panel might just end up on your team anyways. And also it doesn't overwrite other panels. You can't actually like use Totori to remove a blue panel from an enemy and replace it with a red panel. That panel has to be empty. So she has a neat gimmick. I don't think it ends up being too useful in practice, and overall she is just fairly weak. But yeah, that is about it for the breaker tier list. We have a lot fewer breakers than attackers, so this one went a little bit quicker. But basically these are the three to look out for the most part. They're quite strong, but any of these breakers in A tier are also quite solid. So yeah, lots of good characters here, but maybe not in the ways you would expect. And yeah, that's how it is. If you have any opinions, agreements, disagreements, whatever, throw them down in the comments, and I'd love to hear what you think. As always, these are just my opinions. They may or may not be your opinions or someone else's opinions, but I do think this list does mostly reflect the state of the current meta. So yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one with Defenders. Bye-bye.